have time for questions, even though we started a bit late. I thought we could take about 15 minutes. There are 2 microphones on either side of the room, and I would love to give students a chance to ask the first questions. And if you're shy, I'm sure other people will. Come on. Or you can, it's a small enough room, you don't have to go to the microphones, I think, if you talk loud. Yes?
Hi, Professor Sen. Firstly, thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
Thank you.
My first question is kind of regards to something you mentioned in a recent CNN interview on the same topic. And the question is, you mentioned that one of the reasons why the poor remain so prevalent in India is because they haven't mobilized as a cohesive economic unit for their rational economic interests. So my first question is this a concern? Is this a problem with...
So what did I say? I said, no, I try to understand myself too. But I said that not cohesive, I understand.
Right. Political mobilization.
Political mobilization.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Right, in an election, I mean, that they have not voted according to their economic interests.
Yeah.
So the first question is this a problem with the way the poor vote, or is this a problem with democracy at large, which allows for other cross-cutting interests, such as sectarian divisions, religious ethnic divides, that really polarize any cohesive economic mobilization?
Yeah. I think it's an extremely good question, and the answer is both, in fact. I think the lack of cohesion is very important. By the way, one of the architects of the Indian Constitution, and who was very active, who was in fact the scribe of the Constitution, Ambedkar, and he actually discusses again and again in those papers about that unless, the slogan that he liked using was educate, organize and agitate. But education is very important. Recognize what is wrong, really. And to recognize that you have to demand things in a way that deals with the deprivation of general population. It's interesting that when, in the 19th century, when the Labour Party was emerging, there was a Liberal Party, and they were actually, of course, gave birth to the Labour Party, were emerging. And they were trying to talk about classes. And a lot of people on the right-wing side would say, look, it's very divisive for the country to talk in terms of class, because there are so many other divisions and so on. Now, I think what happened is that there was a dialogue in which labor, being working class, became a uniting factor. But that's not the case if you have a gigantically, baroque caste system with all kinds of divisions, and then one caste versus against low caste. Now, those who complain that caste in politics is a mistake actually miss the point that it would not be if it were a united lower caste movement, but it isn't. It ends up being a kind of divisive thing between different castes. And that is certainly one of the factors. Now, on top of that, you have to bear in mind that in each caste, of course, there are some privileged groups relatively and less. And through the means that we have dealt with, which on the whole I'm not blaming them for, because something needs to be done, like reservation and so on, reserving jobs for them and so forth, affirmative action. India was the first country to go for affirmative action in the world. Way before the term, and the subject was even being discussed in this country. But there was a lot of truth in that, but what had happened is that the relatively more powerful, more privileged of the less privileged group became vocal and became very powerful, and then became, occupied the political space, and basically declassed themselves. Not decasted, but declassed themselves, became among the more privileged. And some of them might weigh themselves in amount of gold that that the followers could contribute and so on. And so I think the divisiveness is absolutely central. The other issue is that generally the issue of how how the other half or the other three quarters lives has had amazingly little traction on the part of a community of people who are very successful. I belong to that. Ashutosh Vasni belongs to that. Namely, we're educated. Have I had great adversities? No. Did I have good education? Yes. Did I go to a school and college which I was proud of? Yes, indeed. And did I have huge difficulties struggling through? No, I didn't. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who don't get into a primary education, others who get into primary education so terrible that they can't proceed to the secondary education. And the college becomes drawing from a very small coterie of people, upper class people. And then they created a lot of fantastic things, great literature, great music, great theater, great cinema, beating the world. All that happened. But really, and then of course the cinema everybody watches, but there's a whole group of makers. And if you look at these sets there, they are not taking, I mean, they are mostly taking place in quite phosphorus surroundings, unless you're doing a special movie, like Satyajit Ray doing his film on the Bengal famine. So I think in a sense, we use the expression that India is increasingly looking like pockets of California in a sea of sub-Saharan Africa. Now the California pockets do pretty well with each other, and there's a lot to celebrate there. I mean, I enjoy Indian newspapers when I go there. I grumble about the coverage not going into it deep enough, but they're lively. And in fact, even now here, when there was all this was going on about why, at the time of the Obamacare, as it is now called, coming in, and Tea Party was all discussing how, under National Health Service, you have no choice of doctors and so on, complete lie. And I did think that had it been in India, there would have been at least 2 or 3 major Indian papers pointing out that this is completely a lie. Now, as it happened, New York Times was doing, maybe LA Times was doing, but in the sea of the newspaper reading public in America, it was smaller proportion compared with India. India not only, Indians buy not only more newspapers than any other country in the world, but there's an enormous variety of opinions within the paper. That required salute. But the depth of coverage has still remained very confined. Even the left would be concerned much more with the union of airport workers and organized labor rather than what happens to generally people. So I think both the things that you point to are exactly right. So I don't know whether you're disappointed that I'm agreeing with you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. So I was reading your book this morning, and it seemed that you talk a lot about caste, and caste is used as a sort of, one way that caste is used in the book is to talk almost as a proxy for class.
As what?
So you use caste to basically, in many ways, to say that caste exacerbates the class problem.
Yeah.
So through this social fragmentation, you have all
Yeah,
sorts of...
and the other way around.
Right, absolutely. And in that way, I felt that there was a sort of conflation, or that there was a comparison that was made between caste and class and the ways in which they work together.
Yeah.
My question is that, in my experience in Delhi, there's a very strange dynamic that happens between caste and class, in which caste really obscures our understanding of class, because the loyalty to caste often comes before the loyalty to class. So that someone like Mayawati, who more belongs to the California than the sub-Saharan Africa,
Right.
still maintains the votes of the sub-Saharan Africans living in India.
Exactly.
Rather than the Californians.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do we make sense of this, what seems to me to be a really difficult developmental conflict, where people are not associating based on their immediate interests? There's
Yes.
this representational sort of slant to
Yes.
politics, which really obscures the ability for Dalits
Yeah,
on the lower
absolutely.
socioeconomic end to understand their interests
Yeah.
in the
No,
politics.
but this is exactly right. But the only way I will disagree with you And that's really a interpretational disagreement. I think the substantial point you're making is 100% correct. And you're also right to put Mahavati as upper class but low caste. But what happened is that because the debates have been surrounded with the caste issue, it had made the discussion of class that much more difficult. And that's how the caste barriers have consolidated the class barrier. That's the thing. So we agree with it, and for exactly the reason that you're giving. It's not so much, and sometimes it is the case, I mean, if you are a lower caste, poor family and a girl, you really have something to fight. But that's a kind of congruence. But there's the other one, which is a much more interesting one, much more dialectical one, which is where the caste, because of taking the light away from class background, this is the same question, same thing that I said in answer to your predecessor's question, has a hiding role, which is extraordinarily important. And actually, I would add to that, because even if you complain, if you grumble with the newspapers as to why is it that they don't go for the poor, they will point out they don't have any caste prejudice, they don't. And they don't actually even have a particularly communal agenda. I mean, at the moment, I got a lot of flack. I got flack for two sides. One was from the business media, and the other was from the Hindu Activist Party. Not that I made a negative statement about the Hindu Activist Party. I talked about one leader, namely Modi, who I think was very much involved with in the governance of the state, where about 1,000 Muslims died. And to what extent he was directly involved is a matter for a court to decide. But that issue, of course, really meant that the enormous force of the party's dirty tricks department was unleashed on me, including printing pictures of a Brazilian model, describing in a state of not entirely clothed on the beach, and describing it to be my daughter. Now, I was asked by a newspaper saying, why don't you make a statement saying it isn't your daughter? I said, look, that's not the issue. Even if it had been my daughter, I'm making a point about economics. And if I had been the father of this Brazilian model, I won't lay my head in shame, especially after I learned that I was taken from a film. She was acting a part. So I think I wasn't going to say that, look, this was wrong because my daughter was not that. I was just saying that the entire approach is wrong. That's the dirty trick department. But you see, in this respect, the newspapers did condemn that and condemn those who, even the business side, who actually quoted that saying, I brought it on myself, by attacking Mr. Modi, who is now, by the way, leader of the BJP. And oddly, of course, when BJP was in office, they were leading. I mean, I have good relations with many of them, Advani, Jaswant Singh. I started with my Nobel money, I started two trusts, one in Bangladesh, one in India. And the BJP-led government made a matching grant to the Indian trust to help it survive. So I was making complaints about one particular thing. And there the newspapers have been, on the whole, quite, certainly the English media had been, by and large, fairly non-communal in terms of agenda. Now the story is changed because the Hindu things have been joined up with a kind of business-only interest, and then the business interests tend to focus it in a way more that the Indian mainstream newspapers had not done. But the idea that this mixture, that there are lower castes, etc., and there are Muslims in a powerful position in India, that tend to weaken the dialogue in a way that you were just describing.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I don't know if we want to take one. Yes, back here. Thanks.
Professor Sen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It was really enlightening to hear you speak. You mentioned briefly how India went through a period of centralization. Why do you think other centralized governments, such as the Soviet Union and China, were more successful in increasing the literacy rate than was India?
It's a very good question again. I'm being very lucky. I'm getting 3 good questions in a row. Didn't happen to me in exams usually. But I think there are 2 distinct problems. One is the problem of over-bureaucratization of the Indian economy, which I think still needs to be to be dealt with. And that's a big barrier to industrial development. And it is a big barrier even to the performance, even of the things that you are concerned with, is in education. It may be enormous red tape involved in that. And even on those public distribution systems which the government does, like employment and food security. I mean, employment guarantee has been enormously successful in some states, like Kerala and Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh, and not at all in other states. Why not? And I think to a large extent it's connected with governance. So there's that issue. But much more than that, there was a general lack of understanding, I would claim, even in the Indian national movement, of the importance of having an educated, healthy labor force. And there, I don't know, I mean, I'm not enough of a sociologist, and certainly not a historical sociologist, to see to what extent a caste-ridden society was more likely to have that oversight than other. I just don't know. But it's possible. But whatever it is, the kind of dialogue, I mean, even the first 5-year plan statement, and people talk about saying they don't want to do steel, etc. And a lot of people think that Indians ought not to do steel. Oddly enough, much of the steel in the world are owned by Indians, as far as I can see, both within the country and elsewhere. But so that's not a really debatable issue. The debatable issue was the neglect of primary education. Who spoke about it? Some of us did. Was I being listened to? I think all 17 people who read my op-ed agreed with me. But there were a lot of people left out of those 17. So I think, why is it that it didn't happen? So I think there is a deeper question. I don't know answers. I can ask more questions than I can answer. I can show you that map of the sharp division between India. I don't know what's causing it. And I don't know also what made Indians, which in some ways had a very long literary tradition. Buddha was talking about literacy in 6th century BC, saying that the solution to most problems in the world has to lie on education and knowledge, jnana. What happened if that was a commitment? Now, it's certainly true that if you look at Buddhist countries in the world, even miserable Burma, they have had a high rate of literacy. But of course, India didn't stay a Buddhist country. It did stay for about 900 years, but then it lost it. But somehow lost that commitment. Now, since the replacement was Hinduism, again, of some form actually, there was no religion called Hinduism before. It emerged only afterwards. When that happened, perhaps connection with caste is important. I don't know. But you're asking all the right questions. You didn't tell me what is it that you do.
I ask questions.
But in between a busy life of asking questions, when you have a moment of leisure, what do you do?
I try to study economics.
Study economics. Well, maybe that's what I was hoping. Then it's for you to do. And when you know the result, send me a copy and we'll chat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think I'll give Ashu the last word.
So, Amartya, one puzzle that has to be solved, I think, is this. Nehru created the institutes of technology and supported heavily science education.
Yes.
And your argument, or perhaps not the argument, the hypothesis is that there is a sense in, no, that's not what he said. But there was a neglect of basic education and great emphasis
Elementary education.
Great
full
emphasis on
education.
higher education, which created you, which created me, which created a lot of others. And we managed to do very well outside India as well, not simply in India. Whereas a great mass of, a huge proportion of Indian masses never got even basic education. So the question is a giant, a political giant called Nehru, who is in charge by after 47, and Gandhi's Charkha is no longer as relevant as
No,
it
you're
used to
right.
be. So Nehru is in charge. He is committed to science. He's
Yeah.
committed to higher education. Is he by any chance thinking that let's create the highly educated, trained, scientific manpower first, which will have then a multiplier effect, will generate high growth, which will generate a lot of income, which then can be invested in basic education? Do you think this is the kind of logic he had in mind? Of course, this went wrong, but do you think this was the assumption of the Nehruvian strategy towards higher education and higher sciences, etc.?
Absolutely. And in fact, if you read carefully, I'm sure you've done, in Glimpse of the World History as well as Discovery of India, you see considerable evidence of that. He is meticulously interested in higher education, astonishingly, actually. And at the same, even in jail, he's driving everyone nuts in the jailers nuts by asking for these books. You know, I remember when I first met him. I have to tell you this story. I know it's very late, but when Nehru came, when I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, in '53, I went, and '54 he came, and of course he gave a speech, and he gave a speech in what he thought was Hindi, but of course he spoke only Badshahi Urdu. So, which of course I knew little Hindi, but of course it was, for a Bengali, what is thought to be a kind of highbrow Hindi named Sanskrit. It's very easy for me to follow because most of the words are in common. But the Urdu is not so, and I was looking vacant, and a Pakistani girl I knew well, a classmate of mine, Iran Isfahani, she looked at me and he said, "Look, I see there is a problem. Do you want me to translate your Prime Minister's speech to you?" And I said, "Yes, please." So I got the translation. But one of the things he said in translation, and a joke, because he was asked, and it's actually a very good joke, I thought, a very interesting joke with a lesson, as it were. Namely, he was asked saying, having brought up in British India, what do you think is the most important thing that India got from Britain? To which he said that, "I think you're right, there are quite a lot of good things I did get, but the importance of getting books when you are jailed is one of the glories of the British Empire." The fact that so many people are in jail may not be a part of that glory, but if they are going to be in jail, providing them with books, I salute that. And I think this was very well, but I think his reasoning was exactly the same. And I think it was exactly the same kind of mistake as those who think, let's do growth first, and then we'll do public services later. The Footage-log attribute to a view of me, which is not mine, will do redistribution as if I wanted to do redistribution first, when there's nothing to redistribute. What I've always said, that you have to develop public services that Europe did, and America did, and Japan did, and China did, and Indonesia is doing, Brazil is doing, and taking us to the cleaners. You know, if that happened, Indonesia has overtaken now in many of these respects, because they pay more attention to it. So the idea that you neglect them, first grow, uneducated, unhealthy, unimmunized labor force, and then you immunize them all. That's a kind of gigantic mistake, and I think Nehru would have made a mistake. Now, He was a great guy, and I think his leadership on India was fantastic. On the other hand, did he make a mistake here? Yes, indeed. But the way you're putting it, and this is, I know that you don't take as much interest as you do in philosophy, but if you did, well, there's something that philosophers often talk about, namely Davidsonian approach. Donald Davidson, how do we understand another? Not to attribute irrationality to others, but to attribute rationality to him or her. What is it that she could be trying to do? So what you did was did a Davidsonian analysis of Nehru, and I think that's exactly right.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Amartya Sen.
Thank you. I left my watch there. I'm going to go. Thank you.